we're going to talk about just basic table saw safety when you go to use a table saw, how it is. This is a 10-inch saw stop table saw. So it runs off of standard 110 power. Okay, some table saws run off of 220 power or even 3-phase, depending on how big the saw is, how much work you'll be doing with it. This would be like a standard wood shop type table saw. You have your fence right here. You have a longer table so that you can spread your fence out to cut wider pieces of material. All right, your blade here, power is obviously clearly off. You have your on and off over here that flips out and then is made to be able to slap in if you're having an issue and you need to turn the saw off right away. Now this particular saw, as I stated, is a saw stop. So the thing about saw stops is when they're running, there's an aluminum block that is underneath this blade. And that aluminum block is meant to stop the blade in a split second if your finger touches the blade. So what happens is there's an electrical current that they run through the blade, a very small one. You have an electrical current running through your body. When you touch this, you're breaking that plane there. This drops that blade down into an aluminum block and you don't cut off a finger or anything like that. You get a small nick. I'm not going to demonstrate it. They usually do it with like a hot dog or something, because every single time that blade drops, that aluminum block it drops into and that break you have to replace, and they're not cheap. So that is a safety thing that we got particularly for this, so that nobody can get hurt with that, and making sure that everybody keeps all their fingers. So on a basic table saw, all right, we have our fence, we have our locking pin right here. So if I want to cut something at a certain size, I have my measurement right here and I move it back and forth and I can line it up. Okay, now the biggest thing is when you're doing that, don't ever just automatically assume that a fence is spot on. So if I go over here, and what I'll typically do if I'm coming up to a saw that I haven't worked for, say I go to a 1 foot, I lock it in place, and then I run over here and I can see that 12 inches 1 foot is to the right side of that blade, okay? And you want to make sure that you're measuring up to the carbide on the blade. So a blade, and again the power is unplugged on this and everything, a blade has carbide teeth right here. All right, so as you see those teeth, all right, that's what's actually cutting your material. It's a little bit wider and it's thinner behind it because as it cuts, it hogs in there deeper and then it mills out the wood to throw it, okay? So this blade moves downward like that, cutting in, all right? The more teeth on a blade, the finer the cut, okay? The less teeth on a blade, the rougher the cut. So when we talk about miter saws in a minute, we'll talk about how you can have less teeth on that blade because you might be doing a rough cut, or more teeth for fine carpentry. So you have your blade. You have a drop down fence right here to protect yourself, okay? And on the back, right back here, what we have is we have these two hold downs, okay? So when wood is running through there, this grabs that wood, okay? And when it grabs into that wood, it's trying to hold it so the wood doesn't throw back that way on you if it binds up. And then this bar right here, okay, this right here is your spreader, okay? So when that's running through and you're cutting a board, okay, and the board is cutting, on the back end back here, that could want to start coming together. And if that wants to come together and it comes together on that blade, you don't have a spreader, and this starts pinching in on this blade, it's gonna throw it back towards you. So when you're going to cut on a table saw, all right, you always want to be aware, as I'm cutting, I want to stay out of the way of this wood. whether you're off to the side over here, you're off to the side over here, okay? And there's push sticks that you will use if you get too close, right? If this fence is all the way here, so you're not driving your hands through here, there's push sticks that will push that through for you, okay? So it's just a stick that pushes out here and drives that through, all right? Now, when people are cutting on a table saw, some have a rule of thumb where they will go and they'll take something like this and say, okay, this is 3/4 of an inch, that's my thickness, and they'll go down here, and down here, you unloosen this right here, that's your lock, and you can crank the blade up and down. And they'll put a piece over there, and they'll go, well, there. That's going to cut through the wood and still leave me a little bit, and then you lock this in place, right? And you lock this in place so it's not moving anywhere, okay? So that's where you're gonna stay. I do not do that. And I don't do that because this, as you're going through here, can ride up a little bit. If it rides up and that wood gets over the top of the blade, it can throw, okay? And it's obviously not cutting all the way through the wood. So what do? I make sure that I crank that blade up at least twice as much. So if I have 3/4 of an inch board right here, I'll at least have that up to 1.5 inches, okay? Some people will crank the blade up as high as they can, all right? Now, some will tell you you have the blade up that high, you're gonna cut yourself. Some will say, well, if you're operating saw safety, it shouldn't matter if the blade's up that high or the 1.5 inches that we just talked about, you'll be fine. Biggest thing, do what you're most comfortable with. I would go in the beginning and just go about halfway up, so go 3/4 plus another 3/4 and you're good, so that you operate safely, because people get scared when they see this much of a blade exposed, all right? So you have your blade where it can cut in a straight position. Also on the table saw is another lever over here where you can again unlock it and you can crank an angle, okay? So now I can come up here with my fence up here, okay? And I can cut this at an angle, and right here it's telling me what angle it is, all right? So if I wanted to cut at 20 degrees, I could put it to the 20 mark, I could lock it in, okay? And I know that that's gonna give me a 20-degree angle on that blade. Now, important to note, your blade has to be up high in order to be able to compensate the angle. When you're cutting this, a lot of blade exposed, and it's coming at an angle, make sure you use that push stick. Do not get your hand anywhere near that blade. It's very dangerous. When you are done, you make sure that you loosen it again and you crank it back to 0. Okay? And make sure it's at a true 0. Make sure that line's up there. Okay? And you always want to make sure that you're sticking to that when you go to cut. You want to make sure your blade's lined up. If you're a little unsure, you can always take a right angle and put it up to the blade to make sure that it's correct. So on that saw safety, we want to make sure our blade is in the right position. We make sure that we know that we're measuring for our fence to make sure it's accurate on what it's marked, and we have it locked in place. We understand the parts behind the blade, the spreader and the grabber, so it doesn't throw the wood. We make sure that if it gets closer, we use a push stick. We know how to crank the blade up and down and do an angle with it. We understand our safeties and how they are, and that this particular saw drops a blade. Also, we have this whole table right here. So you can go and cut large sheets of plywood and things like that. But it's important to note, as you're cutting, you're the one over here feeding it in. If you are cutting longer pieces of material, you either need a table back here that's the same height as this, or you need somebody back here at least catching the material so it doesn't drop off on you and come over the blade. And if you've noticed, everything that we're doing on cutting is to the right of the blade. This is where you do everything. This is your drop off. The piece that you want to keep is over here. So if you want a 1 foot piece, you're measuring the 1 foot and you're cutting it through here. But you always want to make sure that you don't have too much excess pushing over this way as well. Okay? So you want to make sure everything's on the plate. Okay, your main saw. You have your measurements here. You have somebody supporting back there, and you're safely out of the way when you're pushing. You want to have one guide hand and you want to have a feed hand behind, right? So you have your guide hand and you're feeding on a large sheet, or you're pushing but you're keeping your body out of harm's way. So if this throws a board out that way, you're not going to get hit, because when that throws a board, it throws it hard enough to put it through a wall behind you. So you don't want to be in the way of that, okay? And even though you have all these things to try to prevent that, it can still happen if it binds up in the saw. And if you get something that binds up in the saw, do not try to save it, okay? That wood is not worth your fingers. It's not worth you getting hurt. Let it throw, get out of the way, and make sure too that you're not just thinking about your positioning, but when you're cutting, make sure there's nobody directly behind you. Make sure everybody's clear. You know, this area right now, I wouldn't operate the saw the way this area is. I would make sure that everything was cleared out before I turned the saw on.